Dear friends, today's message brings something a bit different from our usual discussions. Instead of a typical reflection or news update, we'll be taking a thoughtful and deeper look into a powerful image, one that may appear simple at first glance, but in truth, it holds layers of meaning and quiet messages that many may have missed. This image, officially released by the Vatican, shows Pope Francis seated in a wheelchair with his back turned to the camera inside the peaceful chapel of Gemelli Hospital. He's dressed in liturgical garments and gazing silently toward the altar. While this might look like an ordinary picture at first, it's far more than that. It's a moment suspended in time, a deeply spiritual glimpse that invites us into the silent strength of faith. I encourage you to stay with us until the end of this video, because what we're about to uncover isn't just relevant to Catholics or believers, but to all of us seeking meaning and strength during times of weakness and vulnerability. When this photo of Pope Francis emerged following over a month of hospitalization, it wasn't just a status update on his condition. It became something symbolic. In the stillness of that moment, as the image appeared on our screens, time itself seemed to pause. What we saw wasn't merely the physical presence of an elderly man recovering from illness, but a testimony to something much deeper. The picture captured a man deeply immersed in quiet communion in prayer, embodying the weight of his responsibilities, yet revealing a remarkable fragility. Without words, he spoke volumes, his silence more powerful than any announcement. It was this quiet strength, this vulnerable stillness, that gently swept away the whirlwind of anxious rumors and outlandish theories that had filled the silence during his absence. As our eyes lingered on the image, we began to notice the many small yet significant details hidden within it, each one telling a story of faith, humility, and surrender. The first thing that captures attention is the Pope's humble demeanor. Seated in a wheelchair, viewed slightly from behind, his head bowed low in prayer, there is a sense of reverence that radiates from his posture. His eyes, partially closed, seem turned inward, focused not on the world, but on something eternal. There is no dramatic expression, no attempt to face the camera or pose for attention. Instead, what we see is a man disappearing into the sacredness of the moment, his back facing us almost as if to say, "This isn't about me." It is a quiet reminder that true leadership sometimes reveals itself not through speeches or appearances, but through silent acts of surrender to a higher will. The message is clear. In that chapel, he is not the global figurehead of Catholicism, not the head of a sovereign city-state. He is simply a man at prayer, a man turning his heart toward God in the same way millions around the world do every day. His physical stance itself carries a quiet weight. His shoulders, slightly slumped, reflect the burden of age and illness, but they also hint at peace, a surrender to the path laid before him. The bowed head isn't a sign of defeat, but of reverence and trust. In this vulnerable position, Pope Francis offers a living example of spiritual resilience. Those viewing the image do not see a man clinging to power, but a spiritual father finding strength in weakness. It's as if he's whispering to the world without speaking, "Though my body may falter, my faith does not." And in doing so, he becomes a mirror for all who are suffering. He doesn't ask us to admire his strength, he invites us to look beyond him, to the source of that strength, to the one in whom he places his hope. Another detail that quietly draws our attention is his right hand. Resting gently on his knee, it appears swollen perhaps from the ongoing treatments, intravenous drips, or the toll of medication. It's a simple but intimate detail that tells us more than any medical update could. These aren't just the hands of a spiritual leader, they are the hands of a human being enduring pain, navigating recovery, and yet still offering that suffering in silence. There is no attempt to conceal this. Instead, his vulnerability is presented with dignity. The visible discomfort becomes a quiet offering, a form of prayer without words. This makes him all the more relatable, not a distant figure, but someone who walks the same path of suffering so many around the world know too well. The small chapel itself, though modest in design, becomes a sanctuary of symbols. Every item within the frame seems chosen not by accident, but by divine arrangement. Before the Pope stands a simple altar, dressed in a plain white cloth. Atop it, we see two gently glowing candles, a small crucifix at the center, and a closed missal resting on a lectern, a symbol that the Eucharistic celebration has likely just ended. Off to the right side, there's a portable tabernacle, marked by the unmistakable red lamp, quietly indicating the sacred presence of Christ in the consecrated host. To the left, where an image of the Black Madonna once hung so beloved by St. John Paul Roman II, there now appears the radiant image of the divine mercy of Jesus. His heart is glowing with rays of light, a powerful reminder of boundless grace and unconditional love, especially comforting in moments of suffering and uncertainty. Above the altar, on the wall at the back, another powerful image speaks to the heart. A large wooden crucifix, with Christ sculpted in a unique pose. His arms extend outward not stiffly, but reaching as though descending to embrace someone beneath. It's a deeply moving image, as if Christ himself is coming down to hold Pope Francis in his moment of weakness. The symbolic embrace from the Savior to his servant is unmistakable. It is tenderness carved in wood, yet alive with meaning. The photo tells us that the Pope, having just participated in or celebrated Mass, has offered not only bread and wine, but also his suffering, joining it with the eternal sacrifice made on that altar. And then, there's a surprising yet profoundly human detail, a nearly unnoticed glass of water, half full, placed near the sacred vessels, with a straw emerging from it. At first glance, it may seem oddly out of place in such a spiritual setting. But that one small glass speaks volumes. It shows us that even the Pope, the spiritual successor to Peter, sometimes needs assistance even with the simplest of actions. Due to illness, he likely used the straw to receive water or even to take part in Holy Communion. This subtle image immediately recalls the moment when Christ, hanging on the cross, said, "I thirst." A soldier offered him a sponge soaked in sour wine. Here, centuries later, another servant of God drinks from the chalice of suffering in a different form. That glass reminds us that mercy takes many forms, offering water to the thirsty, caring for the sick, and accompanying one another in suffering. These small gestures, often overlooked, carry a sacred weight. Another aspect worth noting is the Pope's clothing. Even while in the hospital, he has chosen to wear liturgical vestments specifically, a white garment beneath a purple stole. Purple, in the Christian tradition, is the color associated with Lent, a season of reflection, repentance, and preparation for renewal. It's also used in rites for the sick and funerals, reinforcing themes of humility, fragility, and hope. The presence of this color speaks volumes. It tells us that Pope Francis is not only undergoing personal suffering, but is spiritually uniting it with the trials of the Church as a whole. His choice of clothing sends a message. Even here, even now, he continues his mission, standing in solidarity with the suffering and the lost, and pointing always toward Easter, the promise of light after darkness. Yet, perhaps the most poetic and heart-stirring observation comes from a subtle illusion created by what he's wearing. Many have noticed that instead of a formal papal cassock or alb, the Pope appears to be wrapped in white hospital sheets that have been arranged to resemble priestly garments. A commentator from within the Curia noted that the effect gives him a shroud-like appearance, almost as though he were wrapped not in priestly garments, but in a burial cloth. And in this deeply symbolic wrapping, we are reminded of Christ's own passion, death, and burial. It's as though Pope Francis is allowing himself to fully enter into the paschal mystery, not just in theology, but in body, in presence, and in silence. The white sheets wrapped around Pope Francis in the hospital evoke something far more profound than just comfort. They subtly recall the burial linens that once encased the body of Christ in the tomb. Draped over these simple hospital coverings is a purple stole, the liturgical garment traditionally worn during rites of penance, suffering, and reflection. Interestingly, the stole appears to be worn in reverse, with the stitching exposed at the top, as if hurriedly placed without ceremony or concern for visual perfection. This small irregularity offers a tender glimpse into the moment's authenticity. It speaks of an improvised gesture, perhaps someone unfamiliar with ecclesiastical formality assisted him. Yet, instead of diminishing the reverence of the image, this imperfection makes it more heartfelt. It removes the polish and pageantry that so often surround public figures and reveals the reality of a man, tired and ill, still determined to take part in sacred rites with the strength he has left. Here there's no striving for elegance, no perfectly choreographed moment for cameras. Only truth, a fragile soul clinging to his mission, embracing it with quiet determination, even amid weakness. Another subtle yet meaningful absence deepens this impression. Pope Francis isn't wearing his familiar white zucchetto, the small cap he typically dons during official appearances. His head is uncovered, bare to the light of the chapel, revealing both his physical vulnerability and his deep spiritual intimacy with God in that moment. There are no symbols of rank, no ornamental signs of office, nothing to suggest status or superiority. Even more telling are his hands. One of them, clearly swollen and pained, possibly due to intravenous treatments or circulation issues, rests gently in view. And there is no sign of the fisherman's ring, the papal ring that traditionally marks the authority of the Bishop of Rome. Pope John Paul II, by contrast, continued to wear his ring even during his final days in the hospital. But Pope Francis, in this moment, appears to have set aside all outward emblems of earthly power. What remains is just the essence of his spiritual identity, a priestly stole over humble clothing, and a white garment that speaks both of his baptism and his priestly calling. It's precisely in this profound simplicity that Pope Francis's image resonates with true greatness. He doesn't present himself as a world leader or a global symbol. He comes forward instead as a man of God, a spiritual shepherd, a baptized believer offering his quiet prayers before the altar. Even in suffering, he remains what he was ordained to be, a priest who continues to bless, intercede, and offer himself for the Church. In fact, this image taken at Gemelli Hospital immediately calls to mind another powerful memory from papal history, the final days of St. John Paul II, who also spent his last weeks at this very hospital. Many have drawn comparisons between the two moments, noting their differences, but also recognizing a thread of continuity running between them. Where Francis is silent and solitary, John Paul was surrounded by community, yet both images powerfully capture a deep spiritual truth. Suffering, when embraced with faith, becomes a living testament. In the spring of 2005, 2 decades ago, John Paul II was gravely ill. Weakened by Parkinson's and recovering from a tracheotomy, he remained under medical care at Gemelli Hospital. During those last weeks, the Vatican released several photos of him participating in moments of worship and reflection. One image in particular remains etched in the hearts of many. It was taken on the 4th Sunday of Lent, March 6, 2005. In that photograph, the Pope is seated in what appears to be a wheelchair subtly disguised to look like a papal chair. He's vested in a rose-colored chasuble, the liturgical garment reserved for Liter Sunday, worn over a white alb. Despite his visible weakness, every element of his attire and surroundings echoed the full dignity of his office. His zucchetto was firmly placed on his head, and the episcopal ring still shone on his finger. It was as though, through these symbols, he was telling the world, the Church is still led. Peter is still here. That Mass was not celebrated alone. By his side stood those closest to him, his loyal secretary, then Archbishop Stanislaw Dziwisz, now a cardinal, along with his other aides, clergy, doctors, and religious sisters like the devoted Sister Tobiana. His personal physician, Dr. Renato Bozzonti, was also there, along with other healthcare workers who cared for him daily. That scene, filled with both spiritual and emotional weight, communicated something profound. Even in immense pain, Pope John Paul II gathered the people around him like a shepherd would his flock. He was not only surrounded by community, but also visibly leading it, showing that spiritual guidance does not pause for illness. The hospital, in that moment, transformed into an extension of the Vatican's heart. So much so that John Paul II humorously referred to Gemelli as Vatican III, acknowledging it as a place where church life continued even as his health faded. By contrast, Pope Francis's image in the chapel strikes a different emotional chord, one of solitary intimacy. In the 2025 photo, there is no visible crowd, no assistants, no fellow clergy standing by. He sits alone, accompanied only by the gentle flicker of candlelight and the silent presence of Christ in the tabernacle. For some, this moment of solitude has been described as deeply Jesuit in nature, drawing on the Ignatian tradition that values personal connection with God above all else. This kind of quiet, undisturbed prayer time aligns with Francis's spiritual formation. Yet, for those familiar with his papacy, which has often centered around outreach, contact with the marginalized, and warm engagement with large crowds, this image may feel unexpected, even unsettling. Throughout his years as Pope, Francis has constantly placed himself among the people, choosing to live humbly at Casa Santa Marta rather than the formal apostolic palace, and making himself present at the edges of society. To now see him alone, with no one else visible, is jarring but also deeply symbolic. One observer put it bluntly, "This moment marks a turning point in the papacy, one that no one saw coming, not even the most media-aware pope in church history." It's true that Pope Francis has cultivated a public presence known for its warmth, spontaneity, and accessibility. He has often been described as the shepherd who smells like his sheep, a phrase that speaks to his desire to be close to the people, to live among them, to walk beside them. But in this chapel scene, we see none of that crowd. What we see is a man quietly experiencing his Gethsemane, a personal moment of struggle and surrender. Like Christ in the garden, praying alone while the disciples sleep, Pope Francis faces the altar not as a public figure, but as a solitary soul before his God. It's a scene stripped of all distraction, focused only on what is essential: prayer, surrender, and faith. This loneliness, though undeniably moving, also carries a hidden strength. It reminds us that the heart of spiritual leadership begins not in the spotlight, but in silence. Not in public approval, but in private obedience. While it may be painful to witness, this scene of solitude sends a message that reaches far beyond the hospital walls. The Pope's strength doesn't come from the crowd, but from the one he prays to. In his choice to be alone in that photo, Francis underscores the core of every calling to draw from a wellspring of grace found only in personal communion with God. It is in that space of vulnerability and surrender that the foundations of his ministry remain firm. Yet, despite the differences in their circumstances and presentation, there remains a powerful unity between Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis. Both, in their own way, have offered their physical trials as a public act of faith. John Paul II chose not to hide from view during the last painful chapters of his life. He continued to bless the people from his window, even when words failed him, even when his body trembled uncontrollably. His final blessing on Easter 2005, delivered in silence, his hand barely moving, spoke volumes. It was his way of affirming that life, even when filled with pain, still holds value. That suffering, when united to Christ, becomes a beacon of light and hope for others. During his final pilgrimage to Lourdes in 2004, John Paul II was lovingly referred to as a sick man among the sick. And that description wasn't just accurate, it was intentional. It was his declaration that even in illness, one can continue to live with dignity, to serve, and to lead. He didn't shield his pain from the world. He transformed it into a witness, showing that frailty is not the opposite of holiness, it's a path into its very heart. In much the same way, Pope Francis now places himself among those who suffer, not above them. He has openly acknowledged his own vulnerability, not just through words, but in gestures, images, and presence. During one of his recent Sunday Angelus messages, he spoke candidly about his personal fragility, using it not as a reason for retreat, but as a bridge of solidarity with all who carry the weight of illness or physical limitations. He expressed that he feels united with the suffering, not only as their spiritual leader, but as someone who truly walks that same road. And in this remarkable photograph from the hospital chapel, that sentiment is made real. We don't see a man clinging to power or appearances, we see a humble human being, physically weakened, yet spiritually grounded. He is truly one among the sick, praying not over them, but with them, sharing in their silence, their fears, and their hopes. This quiet image tells a deeper truth, that even in the most respected positions of leadership, it is not strength that defines greatness, but how one carries weakness. Both Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis have shown us this in powerful and contrasting ways. John Paul II, during his final years, continued to guide the Church with a steady resolve, even as his physical condition deteriorated. He never abandoned his duties, never withdrew from the public eye, and never allowed his illness to prevent him from blessing, teaching, and being present. His was a journey of endurance, holding firm to the ship's wheel as it sailed through turbulent waters, with his body increasingly frail, but his determination unwavering. Pope Francis, by contrast, walks a more contemplative path. His posture, his silence, his simplicity in that hospital photo all speak of a peaceful acceptance. Rather than pushing against his limits, he embraces them. He shows serenity, not by doing more, but by being present, by letting his stillness and quiet faith speak louder than any sermon. Though different in form, the message of both pontiffs is deeply aligned, that there is no shame in weakness, and that God often reveals his greatest strength through our most fragile moments. These are not opposing ways of leading, they are complementary expressions of the same truth. When I am weak, then I am strong. This phrase from the Apostle Paul comes alive in both of them, as they demonstrate that true spiritual power is not found in control or dominance, but in surrender, love, and trust. What we witness between these two popes is not only a difference in style, but a kind of spiritual continuity, a baton passed from one servant of the Church to another. Pope John Paul II, through his prolonged public suffering, gave the world an unforgettable lesson on the sanctity of human life, especially in its later stages. In a world increasingly tempted to discard those who can no longer produce or perform, he stood as a living testament to the worth and dignity of the elderly and the ill. His visible pain became a protest against the culture of disposability. He offered his own decline as a sacred message. Every life has meaning, especially when it is shared, even in suffering. Now, Pope Francis continues that witness, but in a context transformed by technology, speed, and the harshness of digital media. Today's world is filled with constant exposure. Cameras are everywhere, and private moments are quickly consumed and forgotten. Social media churns through headlines at lightning speed, and human dignity can easily be reduced to content. In this hyper-connected, attention-hungry environment, Pope Francis chooses a different kind of response. He doesn't live stream his suffering or publish daily updates about his health. He withdraws quietly, then returns with a single photograph, one powerful, prayerful image that captures the essence of his experience. It is not a spectacle, but a window into mystery. Where John Paul II allowed his public suffering to become a visual catechesis for the world, demonstrating strength through endurance, Francis seems to strip away the noise of media entirely. He removes suffering from the glare of spectacle and brings it back to where it belongs, into the realm of sacred silence, of mystery, of prayer. His image doesn't invite pity or drama. Instead, it calls for reflection. It asks us to pause, to listen with our hearts, to recognize the divine hidden within the ordinary and the sacred hidden within frailty. In an era where even pain can be turned into performance, he reminds us that some experiences should remain holy, untouched by the rush of likes, shares, or commentary. This decision to release only a single, meditative image after weeks of absence is profoundly intentional. It speaks to the times we live in, a world that too often trades meaning for noise, reverence for reaction. Francis, as always, chooses to walk the quieter path, but it is precisely in that stillness that his message becomes thunderous. He teaches not with explanations, but with example, and what he teaches is this: that even in silence, even in stillness, there is a way to lead. Even in weakness, one can inspire. Even in suffering, one can serve. Through both John Paul Roman II and Francis, we see how suffering, when carried with faith and love, becomes a luminous act of witness. Whether made public or kept private, whether wrapped in ritual or clothed in silence, the pain of a holy man offered to God becomes a beacon for others. These two papal figures, separated by years and different in their approach, are united by the same core truth: that our deepest strength often appears when we least expect it, not when we are at our best, but when we are at our most human. During the final stations of the cross of his life, his last Via Crucis at the Colosseum, St. John Paul Roman II could no longer physically walk the path. Supported by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict Roman XVI, he remained visible but visibly weakened. His frail body and trembling hands still pointed the way to Calvary, his silent suffering echoing louder than any words. That image of a pope united with Christ in the depths of pain left an unforgettable mark on the hearts of millions. In contrast, Pope Francis, faced with his own physical challenges, chose a different approach. He withdrew from the public eye for a time, allowing space for silence, mystery, and healing. Then, after weeks of absence, he re-emerged not in speech or proclamation, but in quiet contemplation, captured in a single photo. In both cases, the choices were unique, different roads taken by two different men, in two distinct moments in church history. Yet both paths were carved not by personal preference, but by a shared commitment to the good of the Church and a deep listening to the movements of the Holy Spirit. These choices, so distinct in form, are united in purpose. They reveal the immense and tender love that both of these popes hold in their hearts. Love, first and foremost, for God, a love so profound that it inspires them to offer their very lives, even their frailties, as a form of praise. But also, love for the people entrusted to their care. Both popes, through their suffering, seek to leave behind a final, powerful lesson, a legacy not written in encyclicals or speeches, but etched in their bodies, in their silence, in their presence. John Paul Roman II, through the powerful silence of his visible pain, seemed to cry out to the Church, "Do not be afraid to share in the suffering of Christ. Your wounds are not without purpose, they are a way to deeper love." His enduring presence, even when words failed him, was a call to embrace the cross without fear. Pope Francis, in this moment, offers a message of equal depth, but with gentler tones. Through the stillness of his image, he seems to whisper, "Remain close to Christ, even when your shepherd appears weak. Place your faith not in personalities, but in the person of Jesus. I am here, not to be seen, but to point you toward him." His very posture in the chapel, turned away from the camera and toward the altar, reinforces that message. It's as though he's reminding the world that the foundation of the Church is not built on the health or eloquence of any one man, but on the eternal presence of Christ himself. And in this, both popes speak a unified truth: that Jesus remains the rock upon which the Church stands, even when those called to serve him are worn, weary, or broken. Perhaps this is the most profound and enduring testimony offered by these two holy shepherds, not through documents or declarations, but through their witness of weakness. Both teach us that the papal office is not about invincibility or grandeur, but about following Christ all the way to the cross. The Pope, like every disciple, must carry his own cross, and when he does so with humility and faith, it becomes an act of profound leadership. When John Paul Roman II showed us his suffering, he transformed fear into courage. When Francis now shows us his fragility, he transforms silence into strength. In both cases, they lead us not by lifting themselves up, but by lowering themselves in love. This is not a diminishing of their role, it is the fullest expression of it. Through their vulnerability, they strengthen the faith of millions. They remind us that suffering is not the end, it is a path to something greater. The cross, when carried with love and trust, becomes a doorway to resurrection. This is the central mystery of Christian life: that loss leads to gain, that brokenness can be holy, and that when we surrender our strength, we make room for God's power to be revealed. In the photo of Pope Francis sitting in that humble hospital chapel, we don't see defeat, we see triumph, not of the world, but of the Spirit. Clothed only in the strength of the sacraments, surrounded by simplicity, he reveals the Church not as an institution of worldly influence, but as a community rooted in faith, nourished by grace, and upheld by God alone. That image, quiet, fragile, yet powerful, communicates a truth we all need to hear in this age of noise, spectacle, and superficial strength. The Church does not thrive because of appearances or influence. It endures because of faith. Its real power comes not from grand buildings or public platforms, but from its people, especially those who suffer, who pray, and who trust God with their whole hearts. Pope Francis, in that moment of solitude, becomes a mirror of the Church at its most authentic, dependent not on power, but on prayer, not on prestige, but on providence. So let us take this lesson deeply to heart. Let us not overlook the sacred beauty of weakness embraced with love. Let us allow ourselves to be drawn not to the symbols of authority, but to the spirit of surrender that connects us with Christ. For when we, too, carry our own crosses not alone, but with Him, we enter into the same mystery that both John Paul II and Pope Francis have so humbly shared. Let us, like them, find our strength not in resisting our struggles, but in offering them. And let us, above all, allow ourselves to be embraced by the crucified one, the source of all healing, all hope, and all love. Just as Pope Francis appeared to be spiritually embraced in that quiet, profound moment captured within the hospital chapel surrounded by stillness, gently enveloped by the sacred light of faith, we, too, are called to open our hearts to that same divine embrace. That image is more than a photograph. It is an unspoken invitation for all of us to respond not with mere admiration or passing emotion, but with real, living choices. The love of God revealed in moments of fragility is not meant to remain hidden in a chapel or frozen in a picture. It seeks expression in the way we live, the way we serve, the way we care for one another. It asks us to move from contemplation to compassion, from reverence to response. Let us answer this divine love with our lives through sincere and persevering prayer, through unity with those who are suffering in body or spirit, and through fidelity to the Church, standing in solidarity with the Pope not just in words, but in spirit and purpose. Let us walk alongside the sick and the forgotten, not out of obligation, but with humility and joy. Let our hands become instruments of mercy, our voices carriers of comfort, and our hearts open to those who carry unseen burdens. Whether in hospitals or homes, in public spaces or behind closed doors, we are given the chance each day to reflect God's love, not in grand gestures, but in simple, sacred acts of kindness. And in doing so, we become more than observers of faith, we become its living witnesses. That image of the Pope, quiet and fragile, becomes our call to action. If Christ can radiate hope through a weakened body seated in a hospital chapel, then He can surely work through each of us, wherever we are. No condition, no circumstance, no limitation can prevent the grace of God from flowing through a heart that is open and willing. When we respond to divine love with concrete acts of service and unwavering trust, we carry forward the light that Pope Francis radiated in that moment. In our daily lives, whether in our families, workplaces, parishes, or communities, we are invited to be carriers of that same light. We are called to become signs of hope, gentle flames that remind the world that Christ is not distant, not absent, but living and active even in the most unexpected places, in silence, in suffering, in simple acts of love. When we live this way, our lives themselves become messages. They say to the world, without shouting, that God is near, that healing is possible, that even from a hospital bed, the presence of Christ can shine brighter than ever. Let us not let that sacred image pass us by without leaving a mark on our souls. Let us receive it as a quiet summons, a call to become, in our own ordinary and unique ways, beacons of hope. But what does it truly mean to become a beacon of hope in our modern world? What does it look like to take the quiet invitation of a single photo, one man seated in prayer, weakened yet unshaken, and turn that into daily action? This is not a call reserved for saints or clergy alone. It is a mission entrusted to every believer, every person who dares to carry love where there is loneliness, to offer peace where there is anxiety, and to remain faithful when the world shouts for quick answers and distractions. Becoming a beacon of hope is not about having perfect faith or knowing all the answers. It's about choosing, again and again, to believe that even our smallest acts of compassion can echo far beyond what we see. In the context of Pope Francis's quiet moment in that hospital chapel, we're reminded that spiritual power often doesn't roar. It whispers. It lingers in moments when no one is watching, in how we treat the person who's suffering beside us, how we listen to someone who is discouraged, or how we lift up a silent prayer for a world that often feels broken. Hope begins when we stop waiting for dramatic miracles and start becoming channels of grace ourselves. That is the hidden strength behind the image of the Pope in prayer, not that he did something grand, but that he simply showed up in his pain to meet God where he was. And that is something each of us can do. We may not be sitting in a chapel wearing liturgical garments, but we carry within us the same potential for divine encounter. Our workplaces can become sacred spaces when we work with honesty and intention. Our homes can become sanctuaries of peace when we fill them with forgiveness instead of resentment. The streets we walk, the buses we ride, the people we encounter, all of these are places where God can be made present through us. The challenge is not in our surroundings, but in our awareness. Do we carry our faith with us into each space, or do we leave it behind with our Sunday clothes? It's important to remember that hope isn't always loud or public. Some of the strongest acts of faith happen in silence, in hospital rooms where someone sits quietly by a loved one's side, in a parent who stays up all night praying for their child, in a caregiver who shows up day after day, even when no one says thank you. These quiet warriors of faith are rarely seen, rarely praised, and yet they are the ones who hold up the pillars of the world. They do not carry microphones or platforms, but their witness is powerful. Like Pope Francis in that photo, their presence alone speaks volumes. In the same way, suffering does not disqualify us from being instruments of light. It often deepens our capacity to shine. Just as the Pope's physical weakness gave new depth to his spiritual strength, our personal trials can purify us, teach us empathy, and shape us into vessels of mercy. Pain has a way of opening our hearts if we let it. It strips away illusions, makes us tender toward others, and reveals how much we truly need grace. The question is not whether we suffer, everyone does in some form, but whether we allow our suffering to harden us or to make us more compassionate. If we look at the image of Pope Francis with spiritual eyes, we might see not just an old man in a chair, but the entire church symbolically laid bare. A church not flaunting riches or power, but returning to its center, to Christ, to the cross, to simplicity and prayer. That scene invites us to do the same in our personal lives. Have we made faith too complicated? Have we gotten caught up in appearances, achievements, and comparisons? Have we forgotten the power of just being present, of sitting quietly before God with nothing to prove and everything to receive? To become beacons of hope, we must realign ourselves with the source of hope. This doesn't mean we need to be constantly smiling or pretending everything is okay. Real hope acknowledges pain. It doesn't deny it. But it also declares, even here, God is with me. It says, I do not walk alone. That's what Pope Francis communicates in that quiet chapel without speaking a word. He reminds us that even in solitude, even in illness, even when the world forgets you, heaven sees you. And more than that, heaven is with you. Living out this truth in daily life can take many forms. For some, it may mean simply reaching out to someone who feels isolated, a phone call, a kind note, an unexpected visit. For others, it may be standing up for someone who's being mistreated or forgotten. It might mean giving generously, even when our own resources feel limited, or choosing forgiveness when bitterness seems easier. Every small act of love is like a candle lit in a dark room. Alone, it might not flood the space with light, but together, thousands of small flames can push back even the deepest shadows. This is how the Church has always thrived, not through the power of empires or headlines, but through the quiet witness of everyday saints. People who suffer with dignity, people who serve with joy, people who pray when no one sees, people who believe that every soul is sacred and every act of kindness matters. Pope Francis, in his quiet suffering, joins this invisible communion of saints, those past and present, who have kept the flame of faith alive not with strength, but with surrender. Let us not underestimate the power of our own lives to reflect that same light. Let us not wait for perfect conditions or recognition. Let us start now, right where we are. If Pope Francis can offer the world a message of peace and strength from a hospital chair, then we too can become witnesses of hope in our kitchens, our offices, our streets, our communities. We don't need special roles or religious titles to do this. We just need a willing heart. And so, let us walk forward with quiet courage. Let us live as people who have seen that sacred image, not just with our eyes, but with our souls. Let us respond by becoming images of hope ourselves, living reflections of a love that never grows weary, a light that never goes out. There's something profoundly mysterious about moments that are hidden from the world's stage, those sacred instances that occur away from cameras, applause, and public validation. In the case of Pope Francis seated quietly in that hospital chapel, the image we saw was just a fraction of a much deeper spiritual reality. For every visible second captured in a photograph, there are countless unseen hours of solitude, pain, reflection, and communion with God that remain veiled from human eyes. And yet, it is often in those invisible moments that the greatest transformations take place, not just for the one experiencing them, but for the Church and for all who look upon such witness with faith. The modern world is increasingly obsessed with visibility. Metrics, engagement, numbers, everything is measured, analyzed, and judged by how much attention it receives. But the most powerful moments in the spiritual life are not measurable. They happen in the quiet chambers of the heart, in whispered prayers, in tears shed in private, and in the silent endurance of those who carry heavy crosses without complaint. What Pope Francis showed us, intentionally or not, is that faith does not require an audience. Its deepest expressions are often hidden, humble, and entirely unconcerned with recognition. That chapel scene wasn't crafted for public consumption. It was real, unfiltered, and sacred. And that's precisely why it speaks so powerfully. This challenges us to reconsider how we approach our own faith lives. Have we become too dependent on external validation to feel spiritual? Do we believe our efforts only matter when they're seen or acknowledged? The truth is, some of the holiest people in the world live entirely unnoticed. A grandmother praying for her family late at night, a nurse whispering words of comfort to a patient no one else sees, a lonely soul offering their quiet suffering for the good of others. These are the kinds of lives that hold up the Church from within, like hidden beams supporting a cathedral. There is great spiritual strength in choosing hiddenness, not because one has no voice, but because one sees the value in surrendering visibility for intimacy with God. Pope Francis, through his silence, models this paradox. He's one of the most visible people in the world, yet in that hospital moment, he embraced invisibility. He turned his back to the camera, removed all signs of power, and entered a space where only God mattered. And in doing so, he reminded us that it's possible, even essential for leaders, and for all of us, to step away from noise and return to the quiet where true transformation begins. The Church itself, in many ways, mirrors this paradox. While its cathedrals and public events are visible and grand, its soul is often hidden in places no one thinks to look: in cloisters, in confessionals, in the hearts of the suffering. Monasteries, hospices, soup kitchens, prison ministries, and tiny chapels like the one where the Pope prayed, these are the lungs of the Church, breathing quietly, steadily, even when the spotlight is elsewhere. Pope Francis's silent presence in that photo reflects this hidden heartbeat. It says to the world, the Church is not a show, it's a mystery. and its power lies in silence, not spectacle. This hiddenness is not about secrecy or shame, it's about sacredness. In Scripture, some of the most pivotal moments happen in isolation. Moses meets God alone on the mountain. Elijah hears the voice of God not in the wind or the fire, but in a gentle whisper. Jesus himself retreats into the desert and later into Gethsemane, where he sweats blood in solitude before facing the cross. These moments were not recorded on scrolls as they happened, nor broadcast for public reassurance. Yet they changed everything. In the same way, Pope Francis's quiet prayer in that hospital chapel, though simple in appearance, joins a long lineage of holy solitude that shapes the course of spiritual history. This has implications not only for our understanding of church leadership, but also for how we live as believers. There's a certain pressure today to constantly prove ourselves even in faith. People share their good deeds, quote scriptures, and post their prayers online. And while sharing can inspire others, we must be careful not to lose the value of what is hidden. There is beauty in praying without posting. There is holiness in helping someone with no expectation of thanks. There is sacred weight in enduring something painful and offering it up quietly without complaint. These are not lesser acts of faith, they are often the purest. Pope Francis's moment of hiddenness in that chapel invites us to find God in places the world overlooks. It calls us to recognize that the sacred is not limited to churches or formal rituals. It's present in hospital beds, in waiting rooms, in tears, in whispers, in hands clasped during a moment of fear. It's present in the stillness that comes when everything else is stripped away and all that remains is the heart and the Creator. We are not asked to escape suffering, but to enter it with trust, believing that God meets us there not always with healing, but always with presence. This also reframes our idea of effectiveness in spiritual leadership. Too often, leaders are judged by output, by how many people they reach, how many messages they deliver, how visible they are. But in truth, the strength of a spiritual leader lies not in how loudly they speak, but in how deeply they listen. Not in how many events they host, but in how often they surrender to prayer. The Pope in that moment was not leading through words, he was leading through presence. He was interceding, offering, standing in the gap for the Church and the world through the quiet language of faith. And perhaps that is what the Church needs most right now, not louder voices, but deeper silence. Not more statements, but more spaces of encounter. Not just public declarations, but private surrender. The challenges facing the world, division, suffering, despair, won't be solved by noise. They require people willing to do the interior work, to be still enough to hear God's direction, to become vessels of peace in their communities. The Pope's quiet image doesn't offer quick solutions, but it offers something more powerful: the invitation to return to the source. So as we continue reflecting on the significance of that photo, not just as an image, but as a spiritual sign, we are reminded that the path of holiness is often hidden, that the Church's greatest power is not in political strength or public influence, but in the quiet fidelity of its people, and that true hope is born not in the glare of the spotlight, but in the gentle flame that burns in the secret places of the soul. One of the most quietly powerful messages in the photo of Pope Francis is found in the visible presence of the sacrament, signs of grace that, though often taken for granted, hold immense spiritual meaning. In the photo, we see the altar set, candles lit, the crucifix present, and a small glass of water with a straw sitting humbly to one side. It's not a decorative scene. It's an active moment of grace. That single image reminds us that even in the sterile, clinical environment of a hospital, the fullness of the Church is present when the sacraments are honored and lived with reverence. For someone like Pope Francis, even in weakness, this spiritual life doesn't pause, it becomes more intimate, more focused, more stripped of distractions. And that's a lesson with broad implications for all of us, whether healthy or sick, active or bedridden, clergy or layperson. The sacraments are not ceremonies reserved for pristine churches and large congregations. Their purpose is not to impress, but to transform. Whether received in a cathedral or a hospital room, they bring the same eternal grace. And in this photo, we are reminded of their quiet, enduring power. Pope Francis, possibly having just received or celebrated the Eucharist, demonstrates with his body and posture that the sacraments are not just rituals, they are encounters. Encounters with the living Christ who draws close to the weak, who touches the broken, who enters the silence of our suffering. A single moment of communion, received with faith, even through a straw in a trembling hand, is as valuable and as holy as any grand mass celebrated with choirs and incense. This leads us to reflect more deeply on the dignity of suffering, not as something to hide, but as something to sanctify. Suffering, when accepted in love and united with Christ's own passion, becomes a powerful spiritual force. It is a form of offering that does not rely on action or ability. It comes simply from being present, from enduring with faith. In this way, Pope Francis becomes a living example of what the Church has always taught: that suffering, while painful and never desired, can become redemptive when it is united with the love of God. His swollen hand, his bowed head, his stripped-down presence in that hospital chapel, they all speak of suffering transformed into prayer. How often in our world do we avoid or ignore suffering? We hide it behind closed doors, reduce it to clinical terms, or try to escape it at all costs. But in doing so, we risk losing sight of one of the deepest mysteries of faith, that Christ himself chose to suffer, not as a failure, but as a gift. And when we unite our own wounds, disappointments, and limitations to his, we do not become weaker, we become sharers in his redemptive work. The Pope's silent witness from his hospital chair calls us to stop running from our pain, and instead to place it on the altar of trust, to offer it not with resentment, but with love. Not seeking pity, but seeking purpose. This concept is especially important for the sick, the elderly, and those who feel forgotten. In a society that often idolizes youth, strength, and productivity, the weak are too often pushed aside. But the Church, when it is faithful to its deepest truths, does the opposite. It places the suffering at the center. It sees Christ in their faces. Pope Francis, by allowing himself to be seen not in glory, but in fragility, affirms the immeasurable value of those who can no longer contribute in worldly terms. He reminds us that the sick are not burdens, they are treasures, not because of what they do, but because of who they are. Beloved children of God, whose suffering has the power to transform lives and heal hearts. There is also a profound communion that exists between those who suffer in isolation and the wider body of Christ. Though separated by walls, illness, or even time, the prayers of one person in pain reach across continents and touch souls they may never meet. This is the hidden life of the Church, a spiritual network not built on fiber optics or wireless signals, but on grace, sacrifice, and intercession. When Pope Francis sits in prayer, offering his own discomfort to God, he does not do so alone. He joins a global family of the sick, the lonely, the aged, and the voiceless, who are quietly sustaining the Church through their invisible fidelity. We might never see their names in headlines or hear their stories on the news, but they are their spiritual giants hidden in hospital beds, nursing homes, or quiet bedrooms. They too are chapels where God dwells. They too wear invisible stoles made of prayer and pain. And when their suffering is united with the Pope's, with Christ's, with the Church's intention for the world, they become a force of grace that no human power can replicate. This hidden communion is the secret heartbeat of the Church. In a world that celebrates noise and visibility, we must not forget this other kind of power, the one rooted in silence, surrender, and stillness. We must resist the temptation to measure our spiritual lives by what can be seen. Instead, we must ask, am I offering myself? Am I remaining faithful? Am I praying with my heart, even when my body is tired? These are the questions that matter, and they are the questions the image of Pope Francis leads us to consider. The Church, in its truest form, is not a stage, it is a sanctuary. It's where saints are forged not through applause, but through humility, where the greatest victories are not shouted, but whispered in prayer, where healing doesn't always come in physical cures, but in deeper trust and spiritual renewal. The Pope's moment in the hospital invites us to rediscover this kind of church, a church that is poor in spectacle, but rich in grace, low in noise, but high in holiness. And so, we find ourselves invited into a mystery. Not a mystery that can be solved or explained, but one that must be entered. A mystery that tells us God is present not just in our victories, but in our limitations. That holiness is not about doing everything, it's about offering everything. That even a moment of pain, surrendered in love, can echo across the world and bring light where it is most needed. There is a quiet and often misunderstood form of love in the Christian life, one that has little to do with words and even less to do with recognition. It is the love expressed through intercessory suffering, the offering of one's own pain, loneliness, or weakness not for personal gain, but for the sake of others. This selfless act becomes a hidden sacrifice, poured out like a libation on the altar of God's mercy, joining in spiritual solidarity with the suffering Christ. In the image of Pope Francis seated in silent prayer, physically weary and visibly fragile, we see this mystery unfold in front of our eyes. Though he does not speak or act in the traditional sense of authority, his very presence becomes a living prayer, a spiritual act of offering made on behalf of the Church and the world. This idea of suffering for others may seem foreign or even unnecessary in a culture that often focuses on comfort and individual fulfillment. But for centuries, the saints and mystics of the Church have embraced this powerful truth: that human suffering, when accepted with faith and love, becomes a source of healing not only for the one who suffers, but for others as well. It becomes a participation in Christ's own redemptive act, not replacing his sacrifice, but uniting with it in a deeply personal and transformative way. Intercessory suffering is one of the most generous expressions of love because it seeks no reward, and it often goes completely unseen. Pope Francis, in this moment of physical weakness, gives public form to this quiet reality. By choosing not to hide his illness, by allowing a moment of his personal prayer to be seen, he models for us how even in frailty, one can still serve. Not through speeches or travel or governance, but through silent endurance offered up for the Church, for the sick, for the lost, and for the broken. This isn't just about papal humility, it is about the mystery of Christ himself, who in his final hours gave the world not a miracle of strength, but the greatest miracle of all, his total surrender on the cross. This leads us to consider the power of the cross in the Christian journey, not just as a symbol of salvation, but as a daily reality. So often, people look to their faith expecting it to remove their difficulties. And while God does offer healing, guidance, and miracles, there is also a profound truth that faith doesn't always take the pain away, it redeems it. The cross is not only a historical event, it is a path that each believer is invited to walk. And the Pope, in his silent witness, reminds us that when we carry our crosses with love, no matter how heavy, no matter how unnoticed, we are walking in step with the one who first carried his to Calvary. This is not to glorify suffering for its own sake. Christianity does not celebrate pain. It celebrates love. And when pain is endured in love, when it becomes an offering for another soul, for peace, for the salvation of those far from God, it takes on new meaning. It becomes redemptive. It becomes sacred. This is the deep spiritual truth embodied in the photo of Pope Francis, that suffering united with Christ becomes light, even when it feels like darkness. It also invites us to ask, how can ordinary people, those who will never wear white robes or sit in chapels beneath Vatican ceilings, share in this same mission? The answer lies not in grand gestures, but in simple faithfulness. Every act of trust in the midst of fear, every whispered prayer in the face of discouragement, every sleepless night spent caring for a loved one, these are acts of spiritual participation in the redemptive mystery. Just as Pope Francis prays not only for himself, but for the Church, so too can each of us turn our personal trials into channels of grace for others. A mother suffering in silence as she watches her child struggle with addiction. An elderly man lying alone in a care facility, offering his loneliness for the intentions of the world. A young person battling illness, yet choosing each day to remain hopeful, turning their hospital bed into a sanctuary of trust. These are the modern-day saints. They are not canonized. They may never be recognized publicly. But in the eyes of heaven, their witness is radiant. We often underestimate the spiritual power we carry. When we say, "I offer this pain to you, Lord, for someone who needs it more than I do," we are doing something heroic. When we choose not to complain, when we endure with love, when we unite our weakness to Christ's own wounds, we become co-workers in the mystery of redemption. The world may not see it, but heaven does, and the fruit of that hidden offering is often revealed not in our time, but in eternity. Pope Francis, in that photo, sits as both shepherd and fellow pilgrim. His bent posture reflects not defeat, but the weight of countless intentions he carries. Prayers for peace, for the Church, for the forgotten, for the future, all of them gathered in that moment of quiet communion. In this way, he becomes a symbol not only of papal humility, but of the universal call to spiritual fatherhood and motherhood. Whether you are ordained or not, whether you are strong or frail, the invitation to offer your life for others is extended to every heart willing to say yes. This also reminds us of the deep interconnectedness of the body of Christ. In the economy of grace, nothing is wasted. A prayer whispered in a hospital room can lift the burden of someone halfway across the world. A moment of surrender and suffering can release healing into a family in crisis. The Church is not just a global organization, it is a living organism, and every soul connected to it plays a part. The Pope's suffering is not isolated. It touches all of us, and our own sacrifices, when freely given, ripple outward in ways we may never fully understand. In this light, the Church becomes something more than a building or an institution. It becomes a communion of offerings, a symphony of invisible sacrifices woven together by the Spirit into a tapestry of redemption. And in that tapestry, no thread is insignificant. Your illness matters, your heartbreak matters, your perseverance, your fidelity, your hidden acts of love, they matter. They build up the Church from the inside out. They bring light to places no bishop or preacher could ever reach. And so, as we continue to reflect on the image of Pope Francis, we are not merely looking at a man, we are gazing into a mirror of what the Church is called to be. A people unafraid of weakness, anchored in prayer, generous in suffering, and radiant in hope. A people who believe that the greatest victories are often won not in noise, but in stillness. Not on stages, but on altars built in the secret places of the heart.